night Anna Kepner died, investigators believed they were finally minutes away from closing the case, until a single detail surfaced that shattered every assumption they had built. For weeks, the evidence appeared to line up, timelines were drawn, statements were taken. The story felt uncomfortable, tragic, but explainable. Yet behind that surface-level clarity, something quietly refused to fit, something small, something overlooked. And when it finally came into focus, it changed the direction of the investigation entirely. This video is the unsolved murder of Anna Kepner, full timeline and evidence. What you are about to hear is not speculation, not rumor, and not dramatization. It is a careful reconstruction of what is known, what was documented, and what remains unanswered, placed in strict chronological order, exactly as it unfolded. How does a case move so close to resolution, only to collapse and await a single unexpected clue? In the days following Anna Kepner's death, investigators believed they understood what had happened. Early conclusions formed quickly. Certain explanations felt easier than others. Some questions were postponed, others were never asked aloud, and for a brief moment, it seemed the case would quietly fade into a closed file. But just as the investigation appeared to be settling, a late emerging clue surfaced. One detail so contradictory that it forced investigators to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. That single discovery did not just complicate the case. It reversed it. Picture a timeline being erased and redrawn. Every assumption crossed out, every confident theory suddenly unstable. From that point forward, nothing aligned the same way again. Why did certain movements not match the official timeline? Why did key information emerge only after critical decisions were already made? Why were some details documented but never fully addressed? And most importantly, who benefited from the case being considered nearly solved before all evidence was examined? This documentary will walk you through Anna Kepner's final days, hour by hour, using confirmed records, investigative steps, and documented evidence. You will see when a narrative shifted, where silence replaced answers, and where certainty gave way to doubt. You will also see how a case can appear complete on paper while remaining unresolved in reality. Because the most unsettling truth is this: sometimes cases are not unsolved because evidence is missing, but because one piece of evidence arrives too late and changes everything. Stay with the story until the end, not for shock, not for emotion alone, but because understanding what happened to Anna Kepner requires patience, attention, and a willingness to question conclusions that once seemed final. The death of Anna Kepner was formally recorded as a criminal matter, yet the classification did not translate into clarity regarding responsibility or method. From the outset, investigators treated the case as unresolved, citing the absence of definitive physical evidence linking a specific individual to the act. Official reports described the circumstances as suspicious, but incomplete, a designation that reflected both the seriousness of the event and the limitations confronting the inquiry. Despite the initiation of standard investigative protocols, no single theory met the evidentiary threshold required for advancement of charges or indictment. As weeks passed, the case remained active but static. Detectives acknowledged that critical components normally used to establish motive, opportunity, and means could not be conclusively demonstrated. Statements collected during the early phase did not align in a way that produced a coherent narrative, and several details remained contested or unverifiable. The lack of corroborating forensic material further constrained the scope of actionable findings, reinforcing reliance on circumstantial elements that, on their own, carried limited probative value. Public records later indicated that certain investigative avenues were deprioritized due to insufficient supporting evidence, while others remained open but unproductive. This procedural posture left the case in a prolonged state of review rather than progression. Although the death continued to be referenced internally as an unresolved homicide, official language avoided definitive conclusions, emphasizing instead the provisional nature of the findings. The result was an investigation defined not by resolution, but by persistent uncertainty and the absence of legally sustainable answers. The final confirmed movement of Anna Kepner were reconstructed through a limited combination of witness statements and time-stamped records, none of which, on their own, established complete or uninterrupted sequence. Investigators identified a narrow window during which her whereabouts could be verified with reasonable confidence, based on accounts that were contemporaneous but not fully consistent. These records placed her in routine settings and reflected no immediate indication to stress, conflict, or deviation from normal behavior. However, the absence of continuous observation meant that large portions of time remained unaccounted for. Documentation reviewed during the early stages indicated that the last verified sighting occurred hours before the estimated time of death. Efforts to narrow this gap relied on secondary indicators, including digital activity and indirect observations, which were treated cautiously due to their interpretive limits. Law enforcement noted that while such data could suggest general timing, it could not conclusively establish precise movements or interactions. As a result, the reconstructed timeline was presented as provisional rather than definitive. Subsequent analysis highlighted discrepancies between individual recollections regarding when contact last occurred and how long those interactions lasted. These differences were not sufficient to discredit the accounts, but were significant enough to prevent their consolidation into a single narrative. Investigators formally acknowledged that the last confirmed movements did not extend a moment the crime occurred, leaving a critical evidentiary gap. That gap would later complicate attempts to assess opportunity and sequence, reinforcing the conclusion that the timeline, while partially documented, remained incomplete and open to revision. The discovery of the scene occurred after concern was raised due to a prolonged lack of contact, prompting a welfare check that would later become central to the investigation. Responding personnel documented their initial observations in measured terms, noting conditions without assigning immediate conclusions. The location showed no obvious signs of forced entry, a detail that was recorded early and repeatedly referenced in subsequent reports. This absence shaped initial assumptions but was not treated as determinative, as investigators emphasized that lack of visible damage did not exclude unauthorized access. Inside, the scene was preserved according to standard protocol, with first responders limiting movement and deferring detailed assessment to forensic specialists. Early notes described the environment as largely undisturbed, though certain elements required further examination to determine whether their placement was consistent with routine use or indicative of external involvement. Photographic documentation and preliminary sketches were completed before any items were removed, reflecting an effort to maintain evidentiary integrity. In the days following the discovery, investigators conducted a series of initial interviews with individuals connected to Anna Kepner in the period immediately preceding her death. These early statements formed the first narrative framework for the case, yet they did not align in a uniform manner. While no account was formally dismissed at that stage, inconsistencies in timing, sequence, and emphasis were documented and flagged for follow-up. Officials noted that such divergence was not unusual in early inquiries, but the extent of variation limited the reliability of any single version. Several statements overlapped in general outline but differed in specific detail, particularly regarding last contact and observed behavior. In some accounts, interactions were described as routine and uneventful, while others suggested moments that could not be easily reconciled with the established timeline. Investigators treated these differences as unresolved rather than contradictory, acknowledging that memory, stress, and elapsed time could influence recollection. However, the lack of corroborating evidence meant that clarification could not be achieved through verification. As interviews continued, law enforcement avoided assigning evidentiary weight to subjective impressions, focusing instead on statements that could be cross-checked against records or physical findings. This approach resulted in a narrowing of usable information, as many details could not be independently confirmed. By the end of the initial interview phase, officials acknowledged that the collective statements did not produce a coherent account of events. The divergence observed at this early stage would persist, complicating later efforts to establish a consistent narrative supported by verifiable facts. The examination of digital activity became a focal point as investigators sought objective markers to supplement the incomplete physical timeline. Records associated with Anna Kepner's phone and personal accounts were reviewed to establish patterns of use and identify any deviations preceding her death. According to official summaries, routine activity appeared to cease abruptly, a change that could be documented but not conclusively interpreted. The precise moment of his digital silence could not be fixed with certainty, as some applications did not generate consistent timestamp logs. Investigators emphasized that the absence of outgoing communication was not, on its own, evidence of criminal intervention. Technical factors, including device settings, network variability, and user behavior, were cited as alternative explanations. Nonetheless, the sudden lack of activity stood in contrast to prior patterns described in available records. Efforts to determine whether the device was powered down, disabled, or simply in use were limited by the condition of the data recovered. Further analysis of metadata yielded partial information, but failed to establish location or interaction with another party at a critical moment. Some records were incomplete or unavailable, either due to system overwrites or insufficient retention by service providers. Law enforcement documentation reflected this uncertainty, noting that digital evidence did not contradict existing theories, but also did not substantiate any of them. As a result, the digital review reinforced a broader investigative challenge. It provided a point of reference without supplying answers, adding another layer of unresolved detail. The silence, while notable, remained evidentiary neutral, raising questions without offering confirmation. Forensic examination was undertaken with the expectation that physical evidence might clarify unanswered questions surrounding Anna Kepner's death. Standard procedures were applied, including the collection of biological material, surface samples, and environmental indicators from the scene. Laboratory analysis, however, yielded results that were limited in both scope and probative value. According to official summaries, several samples produced inconclusive findings or were unsuitable for definitive comparison due to degradation or insufficient quantity. Where biological material was recovered, forensic services reported that some samples yielded only partial DNA markers. These profiles could not be developed into a unique match and therefore did not meet the evidentiary threshold required for attribution. Analysts cautioned that the presence of partial markers could reflect lawful prior contact or secondary transfer rather than involvement in a criminal act. No results were presented that conclusively identified an unknown individual at the scene. Additional testing focused on the potential sequence of events leading to death, but those efforts were similarly constrained. Certain determinations could not be made with precision, and official language reflected this uncertainty due to qualified phrasing. Investigators acknowledged contamination risk and the absence of control conditions at earlier points in time, factors that limited retrospective analysis. The cumulative effect of these findings was to narrow, rather than expand, the range of substantiated conclusions. While forensic work excluded some possibilities, it did not affirm a specific mechanism or responsible party. As documented in case records, the forensic phase exposed the limits of available science in this instance, reinforcing the broader pattern of evidentiary insufficiency that characterized the investigation. As the investigation progressed without conclusive forensic or digital findings, attention turned to individuals whose proximity to Anna Kepner placed them within the scope of review. Law enforcement records indicate that early focus was not fixed on a single person of interest, but moved as new information was assessed and older assumptions were re-examined. This shifting emphasis reflected both procedural caution and the absence of evidence sufficient to formally designate a suspect. Investigators evaluated relationships, recent interactions, and contextual factors that could establish opportunity. Some individuals were interviewed multiple times as part of routine follow-up, while others were assessed through background checks and indirect corroboration. In each instance, officials documented whether statements aligned with available records. Where inconsistencies arose, they were noted but not escalated in the absence of corroborating proof. Over time, certain persons initially considered relevant were deprioritized. Case notes cited the lack of physical evidence, verified motive, or timeline alignment as reasons for this adjustment. Conversely, other individuals entered the investigative frame due to emerging information, though none were formally designated beyond internal review status. Authorities were careful to distinguish between investigative interest and accusation, emphasizing that inclusion in the review process did not imply culpability. This fluid approach, while consistent with standard investigative practice, contributed to perception of an unsettled inquiry. The absence of a stable suspect profile limited the ability to pursue targeted lines of questioning or seek prosecutorial review. As a result, the list of persons of interest evolved without producing a sustainable evidentiary focus, reinforcing the unresolved nature of the case. Surveillance review was conducted in an effort to supplement the incomplete timeline with objective visual records. Investigators canvassed available cameras in the vicinity of locations associated with Anna Kepner's last confirmed movements, including public and private systems. The resulting material, however, proved limited in both coverage and clarity. Many cameras did not capture relevant angles, while others retained footage for only a short duration, restricting retrospective access. Where recordings were obtained, they failed to document decisive moments or interactions. Some footage confirmed general activity patterns in nearby areas but did not place Anna Kepner within the frame at critical times. Investigators noted that the absence of visual confirmation did not exclude movement through unmonitored spaces, a factor that reduced the evidentiary weight of the review. Gaps between camera fields of view remained substantial. Technical constraints further affected the analysis. Variations in timestamps, resolution, and frame rates complicated efforts to synchronize footage across different systems. In some instances, recorded time could not be independently verified, requiring cautious interpretation. Law enforcement documentation reflected these limitations, stating that surveillance findings were supported at a contextual level but insufficient for evidentiary conclusions. The surveillance phase ultimately mirrored earlier investigative efforts. It narrowed certain possibilities while leaving central questions unresolved. Without footage capturing a clear sequence of events or identifying a responsible party, the review did not advance the case toward resolution. Instead, it reinforced a pattern of partial information that defined investigation. Efforts to consolidate the available information into a single, reliable timeline continued to encounter structural limitations. Investigators compared witness statements, digital records, and environmental observations in an attempt to establish a consistent sequence of events. Despite these efforts, discrepancies in timing remained unresolved. Official records acknowledge that certain events could be placed only within broad time ranges rather than fixed points, reducing their utility for evidentiary reconstruction. Conflict emerged when estimated times derived from different sources failed to align. In some instances, statements suggested overlapping periods that could not coexist within the same sequence. Rather than resolving these conflicts, subsequent review reinforced their persistence, as no independent verification was available to favor one account over another. Investigators emphasized that these inconsistencies did not necessarily indicate false reporting, but reflected the limits of memory and secondary data. Analytical summaries produced later in the investigation described the timeline as provisional and subject to revision. This characterization underscored the absence of anchoring evidence that could stabilize the sequence. Without precise timestamps or corroborated movements, the timeline remained a working model rather than a definitive account. The continued presence of unresolved conflicts affected downstream analysis. Assessments of opportunity and access depended on assumptions that could not be confirmed. As a result, the investigative narrative lacked the chronological certainty typically required for prosecutorial review. The persistence of these conflicts became a defining feature of the case, reinforcing its unresolved status and limiting prospects for resolution. Numerous investigative leads were documented during the course of the inquiry, yet many failed to progress beyond preliminary assessment. Law enforcement records reflect that tips and informational submissions were evaluated according to standard criteria, including relevance, verifiability, and consistency with established facts. A significant portion of these leads could not be substantiated through independent means, resulting in their classification as inactive. This process was procedural rather than discretionary, guided by evidentiary standards rather than volume of information. Some leads were initially considered promising due to their apparent alignment with elements of the known timeline. Follow-up inquiries, however, often revealed gaps or contradictions that could not be resolved. In other instances, potential witnesses were unable to provide confirmable details, limiting the probative value of their accounts. Investigators noted that delays between the event and reporting further reduced reliability, as memory degradation affected specificity. Official documentation also referenced investigative paths that were explored and later deprioritized after producing no corroborating evidence. These decisions were recorded with explanatory notes, emphasizing that the absence of results did not equate to disproof but reflected practical limitations. As time passed, opportunity for re-examination diminished, particularly where physical evidence was no longer recoverable. The accumulation of inactive leads contributed to investigative stagnation. While the case remained formally open, active lines of inquiry narrowed considerably. Without new, verifiable information, previously identified leads lost momentum. This gradual cooling of investigative activity underscored the broader challenge facing the case, as avenues once pursued no longer offered realistic prospects for advancement. As the investigation continued without resolution, public awareness of Anna Kepner's death increased through periodic reporting and community discussion. This attention, however, did not translate into substantive new evidence. Official statements released during this period remained limited in scope, reiterating previously established facts while avoiding speculation. Authorities emphasized that the case was still under review, but acknowledged that progress depended on information not yet available. Public interest generated additional tips, many of which were logged and assessed according to established procedures. Investigators noted that while increased visibility can sometimes prompt new disclosures, the majority of submissions repeated known information or reflected unverified theories. These contributions were documented but did not alter the evidentiary landscape. Law enforcement communications consistently drew a distinction between public concern and investigatory proof, underscoring that attention alone could not advance the case. Media coverage occasionally highlighted perceived gaps or questioned the pace of the investigation. In response, officials reiterated the constraints imposed by the available evidence and the need to adhere to legal standards. Statements avoided detailed commentary on investigative strategy, citing the risk of compromising future inquiry. This measured approach reinforced the impression of restraint rather than inactivity. Over time, public updates became less frequent, reflecting the absence of new developments. While the case remained present in public memory, the flow of confirmed information diminished. The disparity between sustained interest and limited answers became increasingly pronounced, illustrating how unresolved cases can persist in public discourse without yielding substantive investigative change. The body of evidence assembled in the case of Anna Kepner reflected thorough documentation but limited explanatory power. Physical findings, digital records, witness statements, and investigative notes were preserved and reviewed, yet none combined to establish a conclusive account. Law enforcement summaries characterize the evidentiary file as complete in form but insufficient in substance to support formal charges. This distinction underscored the difference between collection and proof. Each category of evidence carried identifiable constraints. Forensic results remained inconclusive. Digital data lacked decisive markers, and testimonial accounts could not be fully corroborated. When assessed collectively, these elements did not contradict one another, but they also did not converge on a single, verifiable conclusion. Investigators repeatedly noted that evidentiary gaps could not be bridged through inference alone. Internal reviews consider whether cumulative weight might meet prosecutorial standards, but documentation reflected that the evidentiary threshold was not met. Without a clear mechanism of death linked to a responsible party or demonstrable intent supported by objective findings, advancement toward indictment was not viable. This assessment remained consistent across multiple stages of review. The persistence of unresolved evidence placed the case in a procedural holding pattern. While materials were retained for potential future analysis, no existing data offered a path toward resolution. The evidence, though extensive, functioned primarily as a record of unanswered questions rather than as a basis for legal action, reinforcing the unresolved status of the investigation. Despite the absence of prosecutorial advancement, the investigation into Anna Kepner's death has remained formally open. Law enforcement agencies are continued to classify the case as unresolved, a designation that preserves the authority to review information should new evidence emerge. Official records indicate that materials collected during earlier phases were archived in a manner that allows for re-examination, reflecting procedural readiness rather than active pursuit. Periodic internal assessments have been conducted to determine whether technological advances or revised analytical methods could yield new insights. To date, these reviews have not altered prior conclusions regarding evidentiary sufficiency. Investigators have acknowledged that, without additional physical material or verified testimony, reanalysis is unlikely to change the outcome. This position has been documented as a matter of practical limitation, rather than investigative exhaustion. Authorities have also stated that the passage of time presents increasing challenges. Witness availability, memory reliability, and data retention constraints continue to narrow the scope of potential inquiry. Nonetheless, official language is avoided declaring the case closed, maintaining an open status in recognition of unresolved questions. This posture reflects a balance between procedural obligation and evidentiary reality. While active investigative measures are limited, the case remains accessible for review. The investigation exists in a state of suspension, neither advancing nor concluding. Its continued open status underscores the enduring uncertainty surrounding the circumstances of Anna Kepner's death and the absence of information capable of altering that assessment. The investigation into Anna Kepner's death remains unresolved, defined more by evidentiary limits than by definitive findings. Despite comprehensive review, no combination of facts has established responsibility or clarified the full sequence of events. Official records continue to reflect uncertainty, emphasize what cannot be proven rather than what is assumed. Without physical evidence capable of meeting legal standards, the case remains open in status but static in outcome. Probability suggests that, absent new information, resolution may not be achievable. The unanswered questions persist, and without corroborated evidence, the matter is likely to remain unsolved.